All right, let's see. Now you, okay. All right, so now you can hear me, great. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Christine Ingram. I'm the local interest librarian here at the New Hanover County Public Library. I will be recording the session to go on our website and moderating questions towards the end of this session. Now, we are here today as part of Read Across the County, a community-wide reading program sponsored by the New Hanover County Public Library, New Hanover County's Office of Diversity and Equity, and the Friends of New Hanover County Public Library. Our selected titles this year aim to inspire us to understand one another, appreciate our diversity, and unite our community through art and expression. Our adult title this year is Hell of a Book by Jason Mott of Bolton, North Carolina. Jason Mott has a BFA in fiction and an MFA in poetry, both from UNC Wilmington. Hell of a Book is the National Book Award winner for 2021, and Mott has won the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for fiction and has been a nominee for the Pushcart Prize, the NAACP Image Award, and the Carnegie Medal for Excellence long list. From Mott's website, here's a brief description of Hell of a Book if you have not been able to read it yet. Hell of a Book is a story that goes to the heart of racism, police violence, and the hidden costs exacted upon Black Americans and America as a whole. In Hell of a Book, an African-American author sets out on a cross-country book tour to promote his best-selling novel. That storyline drives Jason Mott's novel and is the scaffolding of something much larger and more urgent. Since his novel also tells the story of Soot, a young Black boy living in a rural town in the recent past, and the kid, a possibly imaginary child who appears to the author on his tour. Today's event is the first in a series of topical discussions based around the themes found in the book. Today's topic is racism in the American South. On July 21st, we'll be meeting to talk about policing diverse communities. And on August 11th, we'll meet to hear about family history and intergenerational trauma. Please be on the lookout for those events and registrations on our website. Read Across the County will culminate in a final event, an author visit by Jason Mott on August 20th. Seating is limited and registrations will open at the end of next week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Jan Davidson and Dr. Tara White. Dr. Davidson is the museum historian at the Cape Fear Museum of History and Science. She earned her PhD from the University of Delaware in 2000. Her thesis explored the history of women workers on the Pennsylvania Railroad in World War I. Davidson worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History from 2000 to 2005 as a historian for the exhibit America on the Move, and as the co-author of On the Move, Transportation and the American Story. She has served as the Cape Fear Museum's historian since 2005. She performs research into a wide range of topics for exhibits and museum programs. Dr. Davidson is particularly interested in African American history and is currently working on a project exploring enslavement in New Hanover County. Dr. Tara White is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where she specializes in African American history and public history. She previously served as the lead history faculty and former chair of the Arts and Sciences Division at Wallace Community College, Selma in Alabama. Her research areas include public history, Southern history, civil rights history, African American history, and women's history. She also has professional experience in museums, historic sites, and archives. Since 1994, Dr. White has worked with a number of history museums and historic sites in various capacities. She has served on the staffs of Alabama State University, the American Association for State and Local History, and the Alabama Historical Commission, where she was the site director for the Alabama State Capitol and the Montgomery Greyhound bus station, which is now the Freedom Rides Museum. Dr. White earned a PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University, a Master's of Arts degree from the Cooperstown Graduate Program at SUNY Anyata, and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. We will hear from Doctors Davidson and White with a chance for questions and comments at the end. I will moderate between in-person and online questions. We'll start the question portion around 11:30 and we'll end promptly at 12. For those joining us on Zoom, please enter any questions you may have into the chat box or raise your hand, and I will pass that along when appropriate. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us. And now Dr. Davidson and Dr. White.
We're becoming friends.
Yes.
It's a great pleasure for me to be on a panel with Dr. White here. And Tara, do you want to talk a little bit first about your first impressions? Then I thought I could, and then we can go from there about the themes, or do you want to do it some other way?
We can do it that way. That's fine. So my first impressions, are you guys hearing us? So Cassie. So my first impressions actually were literary, and I have to say I'm a fan of African-American literature, particularly people like Toni Morrison and of course Ralph Ellison, and those were, the people who immediately popped up in my head when I started reading and really got into this book. That some of the themes that you see for this book, particularly with color, with race, with colorism, and visibility, of course, I saw those, and immediately thought this guy is a fan of Toni Morrison, or excuse me, or of Ralph Ellison. The other big point I wanted to make regarding Morrison, because it seems like he's having a conversation with things that she's brought out over the course of her literary career. And one big one, of course, is that he's writing this book, and he's an African-American man, and he has to, he's been encouraged to not deal with race at all, right? Don't talk about race, don't deal with race. People don't want to be dragged down by conversations about race, right? And I immediately thought about the conversation of someone's conversation, might have been Charlie Rose, had a conversation with Toni Morrison and asked her, about her books, that she's always writing about Black people. And Toni Morrison said to them, well, I mean, that's interesting that you say this, because no one ever says to a Russian person, you're always writing about Russian people. Or no one ever says to a white person, you're always writing about white people, right? It's only to me, a Black writer that I get that response. And I really think it's racist. I really think it's rooted in, I write about what I want to write about, and I'm going to continue to write about Black people because that's what's important to me. And that is the story that I want. Those are the stories that I want to tell. But, and those are the stories that I think are important, right? And so this guy being, told the opposite was kind of interesting. And so, but this is, and in some ways, an homage to both of those guys, to both Toni Morrison and to Ralph Ellison. And you can see footprints throughout the entire book for both of them. So.
Do you have anything else you want to start with?
Oh, no. I was like, do you want to comment on this one?
I totally agree. The first bit, that first piece where the little boy is pretending to be invisible, or is invisible, is he or is he not? You already have that kind of the interesting, unreliable narration. But I went back immediately and looked up Ralph Ellison and the opening of Invisible Man, because I'm like, I have read this before, and I think starting with that notion of Blackness, invisibility, and then complicating it the way that this book does is really, really fascinating.
And so, but, and the invisibility, but then the whole color spectrum, right? Because Morrison also deals with, the entire color spectrum. Ellison was actually saying basically that in many cases, in many instances, Black men are invisible. People don't see them, or they see Black men the way they like to see them, as opposed to who they really are, right? And this guy, he does play on that thing, that people see him for what because he goes out, he does all these talks, and people hear exactly what they want to hear, right? So he just BS's his way through all of these author appearances, and whatever they feel that's what they hear and that's what they take away. But at the same time, the safety, that notion of safety and invisibility, right? That if you're not seen, if people don't see you, there's a safety to that, and that his parents, that the kid learned that very early, and his parents tried to teach that to him, that you're not seen, you make yourself as small as possible, and really become invisible so that you won't be targeted, right? Because that's really the goal of that, is to keep him from being targeted. But then Morrison deals with color. I mean, color on the entire spectrum. You'll see various characters from her earliest works, like Sua, and some of those things very early, all the way to the last book I read, which was God Help the Child. Where she had this very, intensely dark character, who was so dark that she was strikingly dark, right? And she became a model because people were just so mesmerized by just how dark she was, right? And that had both an attractive feature, but it was repulsive to some people also. And so this racial dynamic also, with this person, Soot, being so Black, it just reminded me of Morrison. And then the interracial or intraracial politics of colorism, right? Because Morrison talks about that a lot in a lot of her works. In fact, in her, if you've seen the autobiography, if you've seen the documentary Pieces of Me that happened, if you haven't, it is lovely. I cried the entire time because she had just died. And I think I've read just about everything she's written, seriously, from the very beginning. But Morrison talked about colorism in African-American communities. And particularly because she was a lighter skinned person. She talked about colorism in her community. She talked about it as she went off to college at Howard University. And she talked about it and made references to her, her sorority and colorism related to that. But she talked about, the ways that African Americans saw color, right? And how they responded to various shades of color, and that some were privileged more than others. Again, I was having a conversation with the audience here because with the bullying of Soot, I also thought about the flip side to this colorism thing, and how particularly comedic the bully was, right? And all I could think about was the dozens, and being in junior high school again, and hearing people sharpen their repertoires playing the dozens with particular folks, and also references to, popular culture comedy shows like Def Comedy Jam. All I could hear was Dave Chappelle or Bernie Mac. God rest his soul. Dave Chappelle or Bernie Mac or Chris Rock even. The big, big idea, or the big one I thought about was Charlie Murphy, the late brother of Eddie Murphy, and a wonderful comic in his own right, talking about his encounters with Rick James in this Rick James documentary, and how it's kind of a spoof documentary of Rick James, and how Rick James referred to Eddie Murphy and his brother as the Darkness Brothers, right? Because they were both, very dark-skinned guys, and how disrespectful for real, Rick James was to both of them. And anyways, so there's this, again, really, kind of nastiness, right, with this colorism. And then on the flip side, how people have, taken those things and kind of made them portions of comedy and comedic effect. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So I am much more literal, as in maybe not literary, but literal than Tara is. And I looked at this and thought, if we're going to talk about the history of racism in the American South, the first thing we should do is talk about why we should talk about it here. And so if you'll just indulge me for a minute. So in the book, it's late in the book, one of the many unnamed people, the cop who shoots a child, says, "Don't the past matter? It does, I say, not just 3/5 of it, but all of it." And he's making a reference to the 3/5 idea that only African Americans only count for representation as 3/5. It's a compromise between the North and the South. But he's also talking about the ways that we leave people out of history. And this is a theme that comes up again and again in this book. And so if we seek to make change, which I think part of Read Across the County's goal is, or even just tell history accurately, we need to tell everyone's history. And especially in places and spaces like New Hanover County, which was historically a place of Black majority. So why talk about New Hanover County? These are just the numbers. I have done so many graphs of this, but essentially our county is Black majority from the moment that we have a census, so 1790, but also in the colonial period, anecdotally, up through 1900, through 1910. 1910 is the switch date. Not for most of the 20th century, we see a big change where we see both the fall in proportion of African Americans within the community, and then the fall of proportions of folks who are designating themselves as Black within the people of color. The census changes categorizations, which makes it very messy to compare 2010 to 1900, but we can see this change. So I think we really need to talk about issues like this, both because we were a place of Black majority and because we are no longer that place, and how did we get here? And many of the answers you can find, at least in part, in the themes that you see and the work that is done in things like the health book. So, as we know, enslaved African Americans were the majority in the region until the 1830s, and then Black folks, free and enslaved, made up the majority for the rest of the antebellum period. Slavery is a long-standing part of our region's dynamic. We weren't settled in 1600, where there's still some questions about what being unfree means. By the time white folks start moving here in the 1720s, slavery is an embedded part of the states, and is embedded part of the colonies, and it's an embedded part of our region. So any history that we tell that doesn't recognize that, and recognize that there were enslaved people in the field, in the forest, in our cities, slavery, anything that you look at in the 19th century, you find a person, look at a business, there's usually enslaved labor either directly involved in it or in the household of the person who is profiting from that business. So we really need to be looking at how these historical trends are deeply a part of our fabric, but also if we don't talk about them, what that does as well. So after emancipation, newly freed and previously freed Black men and women created spaces of possibility in the county. They created schools and businesses, they served in the political realm, and they took advantage of educational opportunities to become doctors and lawyers, start their own businesses. We see this moment of possibility and promise. And again, I think you see that up and down in a hell of a book. We all know, I hope by this point, that these gains were smashed in the face of a statewide white supremacy campaign that began in 1897 and led to the massacre perpetrated by white supremacists here in our city and to the coup, the local coup of 1898. So we see the violence that permeates through Hell of a Book, the violence, the threat of violence, and how that really affects the narrator and all the other protagonists in A Hell of a Book. In our area, the early 20th century, after 1898 and across the strait, we see a statewide disenfranchisement campaign that is literally called in the newspaper here, the White Supremacy Amendment. They are not pretending that this is something else. They are literally saying this is designed to do that. African-American men are disenfranchised. When white women get the vote in 1920, Black women do not get access. And we see the rise in legally sanctioned segregation. So we have this era, which the book is really big on history, but you never know where you are exactly in the timeline. It's one of the things that I'm like, is the kid. Is it segregation? No, because we're talking about Tupac. Is it not? No, because yes, because we're talking about this. So there's some really interesting history so important to this book, but the historical timeline is not. And I think that's really interesting for maybe us to talk about how we experience the past. So there's this long period in our region where we see legally sanctioned segregation, and that begins to shift and change here in the late 60s and early 70s through the actions of African Americans, especially young African Americans, through the actions of the federal government. And we see again, just as after emancipation, we see a time of greater possibility where the first Black policemen are rehired in the city in the 1950s. Joseph McNeil is one of the Greensboro Four, and he graduates from Williston. And then there are women like Maxine Brown, who's pictured here, who went through desegregation and was at Williston and ended up graduating from Hoggard, went to UNC Chapel Hill, went to work for Procter & Gamble, becomes their chief diversity and equity officer. A career for a Black woman that was almost unimaginable when she was even first born, let alone a century before. So we do see in our community that we can see many of the things that you see in Hell of a Book sort of play out across the landscape. And so I just kind of wanted to put that out there so that we have our own history in mind as we kind of maybe talk a little bit about this history. And I don't know if you want to add anything either about the history of here or the South in general. I know that's an area of your scholarship that you'd like to kind of expound upon.
Yes, yes. And so the South in general, and one of the things he says very early is that this is a love story. And this is a story about it really is a love story. This is a story about the immense love of Black parents for their children, right? And they love their children so much that they are, you see this with Soot and the kid, that the parents really don't have conversations with their kids about or the nature of what they will encounter in the world. And so the kid has absolutely no idea, Soot / the kid that has absolutely no idea what he will encounter in the world because of his race. He just assumes that it's because he's intensely dark as opposed to because he's a Black man. And so his parents, who do not want to have him limit his ability, right? Have him perceive the world as a world where he don't have all possibilities open to him, right? Which we know historically has not been the case, right? And so I think about this theme of family and the love of Black parents for their children. You know, I go back to, you know, again, the historiography of and looking at the way that played out during the enslavement period, the works of people like John Blassingame that looked at the slave family, the work of people like Herb Gutman, right? Also looking at Black families, and then also the work of Jacqueline Jones, right? Who looked at Black women in the family from very early to very late. And then finally, Tara Hunter's work that looks particularly at the South and the South in the post-Reconstruction period, and how Black families try to work their way through and try to actually create family, right? And the notions of family in the South, and try to create in their children this notion of possibility, right? And that's something that is that's a standard thread. If you're looking at African American history, you know, the families want more for each succeeding generation. And so they're willing to invest, you know, in the periods after enslavement. You see these ads go up in the newspapers for people looking for their families, right, across the South in this Reconstruction period. People are moving around because they're trying to go to places where their families are, or they're moving around to go take their families to places where there are more possibilities. There was a wonderful letter that I use in one of my classes from a guy named Jordan Anderson, who was formerly enslaved, and he gets basically he gets a letter from his former enslaver and the guy who owned him. And this guy says to Anderson, oh, well, you know, I want you to come back because, you know, I need you, and, you know, there's all this and that, and oh, you know, things were really good. And Jordan starts to rattle off, yeah. And he writes this really nice, but very sarcastic letter back to his former owner, telling him, yeah, but, you know, here my wife doesn't have to worry about, you know, sexual exploitation, right? Or my daughters, right, who are becoming teenagers, don't have to worry about being raped by, you know, any of the owners of this particular plantation. My kids can get an education. They learn to read and write. They're taught a trade. They can go out and work for themselves. I've been working. I'm doing very well. I'm in a place where I can provide for my family, right? And so, you know, Jordan goes on to say, because some of this is about, you know, being able to, again, unlimited possibilities. So he says, well, if you're willing to pay me, you know, back pay, right, on, you know, all of the work that I've done for you over the years for free, right? Because remuneration for their labor is a huge part of what these people are fighting for, right? And so this guy says, and so I calculate this and he goes through and calculates, you know, about how much this guy owes him, right? And so if you're willing to pay me, you know, such and such thousands of dollars, you know, I'll come back. And you know, that's not happening at all, right? Not going to happen at all. But again, I think about, again, as we are talking about the, love of Black parents for their children, I think about tragic love in the sense of the story of Margaret Garner, who decided that she would murder her children as opposed to see them return to slavery, right? She runs away in the upper South to Ohio and Kentucky, Ohio, and she murders her children because she believes that, them returning to slavery is the same thing. And so you have historian Nikki Taylor, who does a wonderful job of exploring Garner's work and well, her experiences and the entire, sensationalist trial around her murder of her children and whatever. And this is the story that's captured by, again, Toni Morrison in the book Beloved, and which becomes a movie with Oprah Winfrey and Danny Glover and some other folks. But that these folks, just like any other parent, they had dreams for their children, right? And this is what he's saying, and this is what he sees when he comes back home, that he's the guy who got out, who did very well, right? Who did something unimaginable, right? Or that would have been unimaginable during the time that he was at home, that he could go out and become a famous writer and be, have a national, international reputation for writing, right? So those, that part of it, again, I can see how the references play out here, but and even racial violence. And when I think about the threat, of course, white supremacy was always supported by violence, always, 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 either the threat of violence or the actual commission of violence, right? And so we see in this book, this, underlying, and it's always right beneath the crust, right beneath the surface, this threat of racial violence. And it reflects the history of the South, where you've, in the Reconstruction period, African Americans experienced intensive violence, not just here in Wilmington, and actually that was post-Reconstruction, but around the Reconstruction South. Schools were burned, churches were burned, people were murdered. And as African Americans entered the political process and became voters and wanted to exercise that political power, you saw intense pushback in places like Louisiana, in places like Memphis, in places like Alabama, where I'm from, right? And then later on here in this 1898 racial massacre that not only murders a bunch of folks, these folks, but it also, you also have the overturning of an election of people who were duly elected, right, by the majority of citizens in the city of Wilmington, right? And so, so you see these kinds of things play out in the book also. And it's wonderful to note that, Mott is a North Carolinian. So he had to have been familiar with this history of North Carolina. But then finally, and this isn't something that is talked about in the book per se, but the racial terrorism, there's a reference to the Klan, but what we know historically is that in many instances, in many places across the South, that the Klan and the police were one and the same, right? That there were quite a few police officers who were members of the Klan or members of other racist terrorist organizations, because the Klan is definitely one of the earliest domestic terrorist organizations that they encounter in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South. And then there's the, today. I mean, because, this is a historical trajectory from, the Reconstruction era South all the way up to today. And well, up to the 20th century, let me say that. And, North Carolina has a bunch of military bases, right? And there's a history in North Carolina of, African Americans coming back from wars or about to be deployed to wars, World Wars I and II, and facing extreme violence because they will not stay in their places. Dwight Eisenhower, our former president, talked about being a military person. It made references to it, being a military person and seeing these guys come back to the base, in various bases in North Carolina, right? They've gone out, they have not observed the racial norms, and they were beaten to a pulp by the local police and dropped back off at the military base, right? And so you see that through the 1940s and 50s. And then, of course, we see, this same thing play out in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement and the attempt to, really curtail African-American students, mostly in this particular instance, but African-American protests, right, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But the scholarly connection, right? Scholarship that supports that is, you have this, the work and very recent work of Caretha Mitchell, right? Who talks about this know your place aggression, right? And that's what the military guys, in many cases, experience. That's what you saw at the launch counters, right? These people who got out of their racial place and were brutally attacked because they were out of place. And so Caretha Mitchell, in her latest work, talks about that know your place aggression and violence that African Americans experience in the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction up through the early 20th century, and then also Kadada Williams's work that looks at that same period and racial violence towards African Americans in many cases because they've gotten out of place, right? And there's a and what is particularly poignant and heartbreaking at the same time is that you see this thing being brought forward and another kid has been shot, another person has been shot, another Black man has been shot by the police, right? In some dubious situation. And, I can't help but to go back to think about people like Trayvon Martin and, Michael Brown and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland, right? Trayvon just came in contact with, someone who was determined to be a vigilante, but Michael Brown, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland all died at the hands of the police, right? And that is, that's 21st century, right? And something that is poignant. But then the other big point that the uncle and other Black men in the book make, and that African Americans are constantly making, is there is no justice. The absence of justice for the people who have experienced racial violence in the past, right? We think about things like there was a movement not too long ago by people to bring the wife of the killer of Emmett Till, right, to make her accountable for his murder, okay? But there was never any justice for his murder. No one ever paid a price for his murder. And this idea that law and justice does not work for Black men, right? Law and justice does not work for Black men and Black people is a historical theme that is worth repeating. And so you see the uncles and the other guys, you have the folks inside the church who are kind of listening to the preacher and yes, and whatever. And then you see a group of only Black men in the very back of the church who are saying, hell no, this is one more thing, right? And this is one more group of folks, one more police officer who's gonna get off. And this is one more thing, right? One more grievance, one more, and you can call it grievance, but the absence of justice, right? In a country that is about law and order, right? The absence of justice when the rule of law is supposed to be the thing that we as a nation go back to is something that comes up again and again and again. And it's a central theme in not only this book, but we see this in all of these things that we've seen in the early 21st century. So.
Yeah, and I think if I can just jump on the back of that, there's a couple of places in the book where there's a quote about, it wasn't just fear, it was a truth proven time and time again for generations. Certain bodies don't belong to their inhabitants, never have, never will again. And there's a really interesting, and there's another piece where Mott talks about that at some, you first go out and you protest about a person dying under an unjust circumstance, and at some point you can't even remember that person's name because the accretion of that onto us. So I think that there's a really interesting piece. I understand what you're saying about it being about love and about family. There's a lot of pain in this book and a lot of fear in this book. And even the joy is, it's almost like there's a piece at the end that says something like, even imagining that you can have a happy life is a form of resistance. And that's not what it says because I'm not a poet, but I do think that there's a really interesting way that that this book works in that way. I also think from listening to you and thinking about what's been said in the book, there's a really Mott does an incredibly great job of showing you a variety of perspectives of what history means. And it's not a simple one either, because Soot's grandpa basically says a version of white people didn't do anything to you, all those people are dead. So does the police officer that shoots a cop and who basically says, shoots the kid and basically says to the unnamed author, we grew up together, we had the same experience, and actually you're doing better than I am. So why are you giving me this crap? But I think that there's a lot about history in here, and that if you view things as simply incidents that occur, you can talk yourself into saying this is not how the world works. But for most of the Black folks in this book, there isn't, and most African Americans in this country, there isn't really that option, because you see so much embedded and inherent racism that you can't really say this is just an outlier. It's embedded in the fabric, and you see that intergenerational trauma. There's a media consultant in the book, Jack, one of the few people with a name, right? And he basically says, when someone treats you terribly, the last thing they want is for you to behave as if they've treated you terribly. If I punch you in the neck, I don't want you bringing up that time I punched you in the neck. And I think that that is at core the conflict, or the disjuncture in this book, is that there are folks who don't want to acknowledge the pain that they've caused, and other people who are screaming, you have to see me. And again, it's back to that visibility and unvisibility. Is it safer to be visible, but in an unrecognizable way? The author, I don't like him. like the guy traveling across the country to begin with. I'm like, you're a drunk, you're kind of a philanderer, or you are a philanderer, you're not very nice. And by the end, you're like, well, but you're also full of pain and trauma, and these are manifestations. And I don't even know who's who anymore. And there's a piece that says, it doesn't matter who's who. What matters is that we have to grapple with these things. And so I do think in the end, it is a love story, but there's a lot of pain in it too. And there's really good research that shows communities that experienced lynchings and violent altercations and attacks the way that our community have, even when they're gone, they have long-standing effects on how people experience the world, and they divide us, even if we can't explain what happened in 1971 with the Wilmington 10, or what happened in 1898. They live in the fabric of our community.
And you are correct. You see why we're friends. And so we do have this immense pain, but part of, and I guess this is part of the Black experience in America, is this immense pain, this immense injustice, the continued injustice, because you have a lot of folks who just really refuse to see that that race does matter, right? And that people have, some of the things that we thought we had conquered and we had overcome, and the challenges we thought we got beyond, we have not, right? And so that is a big part of what he's saying here. But at the same time, as a Black person, you exist in this constant tension, right? And I go back to Jack, telling him, you don't want to don't want to be a Black author. You just want to be an author. You want people to enjoy your work and enjoy your book, and you want everybody to read it and to be able to see themselves there, right? And you don't want this, racial grievance and all of this, racial stuff, because all it does is drag it down, right? It makes, your book heavy, and people don't want to read that. They don't want to do that. And at the same time, he's grappling with that. But again, you have this tension between the heavy and joy, right? Again, that is the, that's the essence of being Black in America. An intense pain and immense joy at the same time. And so we want to, I want to use a quote by Ossie Davis. And this is something that is really important for us, I think, to keep in mind. And Ossie said this, he said, "I find in being Black a thing of beauty, a joy, a strength, a secret cup of gladness," right? And so this notion of Black joy, that being African-American is not just, we're just, folks aren't running around singing the blues all the time, that there's joy, and there's, and again, goes back to that love story. There's love and there's joy and there's family there. I saw the, again, I went back to the backyards when he was going down, and he could see people in their backyards, and he heard music. He heard Marvin Gaye, and he heard Frankie Beverly, or that and Donna Summer, and all of these guys, right? And so, and my mind immediately went back to my own childhood, right? And my own summers of people having cookouts, right, in their backyards and having their families over, and the notion of family. Again, we do have these intense experiences, but we also have joy. Blackness is not just and the notion, and this is where, people are going, being Black is not a burden, it is a joy. And he gets to that place at the very end, right? Where you see this beautiful Black peacock that's completely Black, right? And he's trying to show this, I think it was the kid, the feathers of it, but then the kid couldn't really see the feathers in his hand. And I don't know if he was seeing the peacock.
Yeah.
It was an illusion or whatever. But the beauty, the immense beauty of being Black is that he eventually gets there and is able to see that and to experience that. And I have to go back, because historians are, there are many of us who talk about a whole lot of ugly and awful, but then there are a whole lot of us who are looking at things like Black joy. I'm excited for a colleague here in North Carolina who just did a book on Tara Green. I probably like her because her name is same, right? I'm Tara White, she's Tara Green, but she's Tara Green is at Greensboro actually, and she just did a book. Well, she did 2 books. I want to be like Tara Green. Tara did a book on Alice Dunbar Nelson, who was the wife of Paul, first wife, Paul Lawrence Dunbar, African-American poet. But Tara also, Dr. Green, also did a book on pleasure, right? African-American women and pleasure, right? Because yes, we enjoy pleasure too. And so that was one big pushback, because joy, Black joy is resistance, right? That we have happiness and love and joy, that is resistance. And I want to make that big point. It is resistance. And so Tara Green's work, but then also I'm waiting on A'Lelia Bundles, who is the great, I think it's 3 greats, granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. She's her official biographer, but A'Lelia is writing about her namesake, A'Lelia Walker, who's the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker. A'Lelia Walker actually was a patron for the Harlem Renaissance, and actually sponsored all these wonderful salons. She had people as varied as W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, to Langston Hughes in these salons, right? You had all of the, Alberta Hunter from, yes, right, to jazz people of the hour at the same time. And so she knew a lot of people and spanned a lot of socioeconomic levels and whatever, but the whole of the Renaissance, right, you could see represented in the life of A'Lelia. And so the book title, the tentative title for this book, I probably need to build Ms. Bundles. I love the title though, and it's Black, it's Joy Goddess of Harlem, right? Because joy was resistance, right? And that we would continue to have families and have love and have joy in the midst of the trauma, right, of the Jim Crow period and beyond is something that needs to be celebrated. So.
Yeah, so since we're on that, I think we're going to move to questions.
Yep.
But there is a Jason Mott quote, and it's laugh all you want, but I think learning to love yourselves in a country where you're told that you're a plague on the economy, that you're nothing but a prisoner in the making, that your life can be taken away from you at any moment and there's nothing you can do about it. Learning to love yourself in the middle of all that, hell, that's a goddamn miracle. Mm-hmm. And he almost never says hell in the book apart from when he's using his own title. Mm-hmm. So I think that his words sort of really resonate with what you've just been saying, Tara. wanted to finish on that, at least for that piece.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I did have a hand here online, and what we'll do now, we are moving on to the question and answer portion. So if anybody online has a question or comment, please feel free to raise your hand or put it into the chat box and I can communicate that. And then also anybody here in the room, if you all have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we will address those as well. So, but first of all, I believe Julie online had a question. Julie, do you want to, let's see, do you want to send, let's see if we can, if I can unmute you, but I don't have speakers on. So hold on. Julie? Won't do that. All right.
One of them is giving you feedback from the other, so
Yeah.
you'll have to mute.
Let's.
I learned this from the children. My students who are real adults, who are really grown people. They were like, no, Dr. Lloyd, you have to mute one because I had the way the thing was set up. I had somebody streaming in.
Yeah, I went to a conference and it did that. And I don't know who figured it out, but it was not me.
It wasn't me either. Like I said, the students. Yeah.
Let's see. It looks like it's not letting me ask her to unmute. Julie, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat box. And in the meantime, anybody here in the room, do you all have any questions, comments? I have a lot of thank you for this presentation. Yeah. Such a great conversation. Lots of people are very happy and excited and thankful that we're having this conversation. Thank y'all so much. This has been great.
So Tara, you're kind of literary. You obviously read a bunch. Do you think that the fact that you kind of tell what time it, where you are in time was done on purpose?
I think it was.
I do too, because he talks a lot about the past, present, and future being interchangeable.
Mhm.
So that the way that the book really doesn't let you know when is when, because it's every time,
Mhm.
but it also is sort of a specific time. I don't know. I thought that was really clever, but very confusing sometimes. But that was kind of the point. I wondered if that was just me.
No. I think that was the point, and it showed the enduring the presence of some of these issues, right? That from the, I as a historian, I'm thinking about my own research and looking at early 20th century where people are requesting African-American police officers because they are experiencing violence with the white police officers. I think about them going into the 1940s and 50s, the same thing, the request for African-American police officers because they're experiencing violence with white police officers, and they think there will be a different outcome. And then if you look at the requests from early 20th century, people and groups of folks like various NAACP chapters across the South really see those get out. And my research is specific to Alabama and the South, but Alabama in particular, you have NAACP chapters pop up in the 19 teens, right? 1918, 1919, of course, is the horrible summer of 1919, right? Red Summer, as James Weldon Johnson called it, where you have a record number of race riots across the country, and it's not the South, not just the South, which is another big thing that we need to keep in mind, that this isn't just the South. I mean, you know, East St. Louis, Illinois, the race riot there really kind of kicks this thing off. The NAACP is founded after a race riot, right? Where Black people are viciously attacked. And this is in the Midwest, it's not the South, right? And people are just so stunned and horrified that they, Black and white, get together and create the NAACP. And so, I see this, recurring, these recurring themes of, requesting Black police officers to, and early 20th century, and then by the time of the Civil Rights Movement. I'm thinking about a couple of statements, SNCC in particular, but the Atlanta student movement, right, in 1960, they list out their demands, and one is that they hire Negro police officers. The Montgomery bus boycott. At the end of the boycott, that's one of the demands for the folks in Montgomery, that they hire Negro police officers to police Negro areas.
Yeah, and it's a little different here, right? Because we had African-American police officers, and then those folks were fired after 1898. We have this very clear division where anybody who works for the city who's Black, one of the demands of the White Declaration of Independence is to give jobs to white men so that they can support their families and take them away from Black families. So all the firefighters, half of the firefighters at the time were African-American, and any African-American police officer lost their job at that point. And then we see it come up again in the 1950s, where I think I showed a picture, which is the 1954 is the first Black men hired by the police department again. And there's a big push by the Wilmington Journal, the Black newspaper, our Black newspaper, to do that. And it's fascinating. I haven't quite unpacked this, but they hire women crossing guards before they hire Black male police officers. I think in some ways in a hope to stop that demand from moving forward. But T.C. Gervais, who is the main person in the Wilmington Journal, constantly puts ads in the journal saying, we are the only city in North Carolina, big city in North Carolina, that doesn't have a Negro policeman, and we need to have one now. And so it is kind of interesting that you see those patterns occur, come back and in and out, but also that, these police officers or the police are the center of violence as well. So it's like, does it change? Does the face of who's an officer in there change what happens on the streets or not? And I think we've seen that sometimes it doesn't. Which I don't know that's addressed in how the book, but it's definitely state-sanctioned violence, and the way that unfolds is clearly a really important part of this book and a really important part of our community's history.
And the South's history. Definitely. That and state-sanctioned violence, and there is no recourse, right? There is no justice. When I lived in Montgomery, I lived in an apartment building downtown Montgomery. And right next to that apartment building, there was a center for victims, right? That was named after a young lady who was murdered by a guy who was hopped up on drugs and tried to rob her. And then he murdered this young college student. And her mother, crime victims compensation is what it was called. So she created the Center for Victims of Violent Crimes. And I just, I thought about that as we had an incident in Montgomery of this young Black man who was murdered by the police. And he was just leaving somebody's house, a late card game and headed home, walking home in his own neighborhood, right? And this like police officer happens upon him. Actually, I guess he didn't give a clear enough answer to him or whatever. But anyways, and he lived right around the corner, right? He encounters him. There's a scuffle, and he, basically murders the guy, right? And I just, it's like, but aren't these people victims of violent crime also, right? And so the way that we see victimhood, right, and the way that we talk about victimhood, well, first is awful. It's this awful, conversation about Black grievance and victimhood, but there were Black folks who were real victims, right? And so do you blame, well, I'm not even gonna ask that question because, I can go, I do women's history too. So I can go into an entire conversation about blaming the victim. Yeah, I'm not gonna ask that question. Yes.
Nope, go right ahead.
Well, I appreciated your saying it's not just the South. I moved here from Mexico. The LA, I'm sure you know, the LAPD, the LA sheriffs are more and more information is coming out, fortunately, that they are full of Proud Boys and other versions of the KKK. And we have so many incidents of, a Black man who's in his grandmother's backyard is shot, and there's no justice. So it's everywhere. But you're so right that people who are killed by the police obviously are victims. Well, they're victims of terrorism. And the LAPD cars all say to protect and serve. And it's so obvious that they protect and serve with your life. I mean, it's everywhere.
Where I grew up, so I did not grow up in this country. I grew up in the UK, and the Metropolitan Police in the 1980s were notorious for their racism and their misogyny and their violence. And fortunately, they don't usually have guns, which does make a big difference. But we talked a lot about when you call something a police force, which is what they did, what that sets you up for, rather than calling them a police service. And it's definitely not the only thing that matters, but I do think that thinking about how you talk about what the police do for you and how that works. It's really a part of this book, but it's also a part of our history and a part of our stories. And there was a 17-year-old African-American shot in Wilmington during the Wilmington 10 incidents. And he was shot by a police officer and he died. And there's a little bit about, does he have a gun? Does he not have a gun? There's definitely some ambiguity about the story, but the police chief at the time told the newspaper that he was sure it was justifiable, basically the next day. And then about a month later, they said it was justifiable. So I don't think we'll ever know the real facts of that story, but the fact that in the 1971, that is what the police chief said to the newspaper, without, I don't think, there seemed to be no evidence that it had actually done an investigation at that point, is really telling about the ways that the assumptions that you bring to the table about what you can tell about somebody based on the way that they look or what their gender is or what other stereotypes you hold is not simply a matter of private preference, but has these huge impacts on the rest of the people's experiences and can be deadly. And I think that the hell of a book is, I mean, how many people die in this book? And every single person who dies at the hands of the police tries a different tactic for not dying at the hands of the police. And he says this a couple of times, you can have the talk, you can do the work, you can try and protect your children by not making them racially conscious, you can try and protect your children by making them racially conscious, and in the end, it probably doesn't matter. And that is, actually I'm giving myself goosebumps, even though it's really Jason Mott who's giving me goosebumps, but that I think is a really important thing for us to wrestle with and think about. And while yes, there are pieces as a parent of a child that I read in this book and had connection to, regardless of the fact that my kid's a white guy, right? Like the fear that you have about, did you bring a child into a world that's going to explode? The ecology, the ecosystems where, but there are other things in here that, I think you can empathize or sympathize with, but are really particular to the experience of parents of color and African American parents in particular that, even thinking about, I talked to my kid about racism really early, but that's because I'm a historian and because he asked, and I figured that you don't lie to your children. But lots of white parents don't have to and don't. And it's part of the way that you end up with people like Jack, the media consultant, saying, oh, this stuff is all new. It didn't used to happen. Well, yes, it did. We just didn't talk about it as much. There's this whole kind of white amnesia that also is the part of the sort of superstructure, infrastructure, whatever the right word is, of this book, the architecture of this book. So I think he does a really great job of giving you ways to think about these issues in multiple layers. And even if you don't like the unknown author, or you think you get obsessed with whether soot is the kid, it's in some ways it doesn't matter, that it's such a wonderful, rich thinking experience.
I want to go back to a point you made about having the talk with your children or not having the talk with your children. And so this makes me think of the work of Charles Dew, a Southern historian, who for many years, award-winning Southern historian, very well known, who decided to explore his own childhood growing up in the South, and to look at the various ways that our ideas about how we view race, right, are into how dinner with her, never had dinner with her. She never came to the house for dinner and socialized with other people who were there, right? And so those ideas, although you're not expressing them, you are expressing them. And that was the point he was making about growing up. Although his parents were never explicitly racist, right? Or they never explicitly explicitly said anything about race. What they did, right? Their behaviors taught him very loudly about race, right? And so, the fact that he didn't have, they never had Black people in their house eating dinner with their family. They never saw their parents interact with African Americans on a peer-to-peer basis, right? Or any African Americans on a peer-to-peer basis. It was always a master and subservient kind of situation, right? Those are markers for people, right? And what they say is that this is not your social equal, that this person is in another place. And it's another way if we think about, go back to Caretha Mitchell's work, this whole know your place, right? And know your status, right? And so we created a society where people are second class, and we put them in that box, and we expect for them to stay there, right? And that is something that children see very early. Children are astute observers of the world and of our behaviors, right? And so when they act out the things that we're doing but not saying, then where in the hell did he get this idea? But he got the idea, right, from how he saw the adults in his life or her life behave. Right? And so those are the kinds of things, as you're thinking about your children or your grandchildren or nieces and nephews or whatever, that is real, and those are very powerful examples. As I, had a conversation with someone, and they asked me, actually I had a conversation with a person I worked for years ago. And the person asked me, the person was not Southern, the person was Midwestern. Now I have a whole, I'm not gonna make that statement. Because I have a whole thing about Midwesterners, who think they're exceptional, and I've experienced some really interesting, I've had some really interesting interactions with Midwestern people that I've not had with Southerners. Let me say that. So the person says to me, well, do you, think I'm a racist? And I was like, well, number one, this is my superior. So where the hell is this conversation coming from? And number two, if I thought you were a racist, you really think I'm gonna say, well, so-and-so, yeah, I think you're, kind of racist. No, I'm not gonna say that. I'm on my damn job. So I'm gonna keep my job. So I said, well, I asked them about their own behaviors, right? Hoping that they would get it, that, okay. And
It's racist to ask you if you're
Yeah.
a racist. Yeah.
anyways, weird, but, and that's one of the weirdnesses that I've experienced in my life. But behavior, what you do says a lot about what you believe. I believe that in the 5 decades that I've been alive, I believe that down to my toenails. What you do says a lot about what you believe. We do what we believe. We live what we believe. So.
I do have a comment online, and then we're gonna have to kind of wrap up. So the comment online is from Gary. It brings a tear to my eye when your conversation makes me remember racism when I was in elementary school. I was born in 1963. The children in this public school were divided into groups, the A, B, C, and D groups. The A group was all white except for a couple of Black children. The D group was majority Black children, only a couple of white children. I was privileged to be in the A group, but sometimes I wish I'd been in the middle. I'm thankful that my mama and daddy were raised farming, working side by side with Black and white people, and put me to work in the summers on farms. I'm a writer and hope that my background comes through in my work. Thank you for making me think. I appreciate your conversation today. And I think that sentiment really has been echoed multiple times throughout this. Just thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your experience, everything. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And I just, the last couple of minutes here, we've touched on the 2 next upcoming conversations we're going to be having. We are going to be, this is a 3-part series, and the next part is going to be July 21st in the evening from 5:30 to 7. And it is about policing diverse communities. And we have law enforcement, retired law enforcement personnel. We have a number of experts in the field who will be there. And then the final conversation we'll have is August 11th. And that is also going to be in the evening. and that will be about family history and intergenerational trauma. And we have, again, experts in the field who will be coming as well. So again, thank you, Dr. White, Dr. Davidson. We really appreciate you being here today. And thank you.
Well, I really appreciate that you invited me and that you invited me with Tara so that we could have that conversation, because we have had a couple on the run up to it and it's been just as thought-provoking and engaging, and I appreciate your vulnerability, Tara, because you don't need to tell us these things, but it helps for folks to understand. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us. Like I said, this is.
Yeah, we're new best friends.
Don't joke. And I think humanizing. Right. And then that's why I think it's important for people to see it from a variety of perspectives that, you know, me, a live, human being, you know, I'm able to talk about my experiences and to, you know, just really reaffirm the basic humanity of people, of Black people. That's, I think, what he's doing, and Black writers in general. That's you know, really the baseline of Toni Morrison, the baseline of Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, all these guys. They're guys and girls. They're, you know, really trying to reaffirm and get folks to see beyond stereotypes of people.
And how important it is to listen, right?
Yes.
That this book is a really clear example of that. If we talk about the Black community, then we're not really talking about anything, because there is no one community, and that there are layers and textures within it and divisions within it, and much nuance. But that this book, in the way that it kind of explores history through multiple perspectives and shows you all these different events through multiple perspectives, and has this wildly imaginative piece as well. It's just a really important corrective to this kind of one-size-fits-all version of our past that does none of us any service.
I haven't finished this, but no, I've read his Something About the World. It's beautiful, about a girl who develops supernatural powers. And then I started this one and I haven't finished it. I'm pretty far along enough that to talk about it or hear about it, you know. Oh my God. So yeah, it's really quite a good writer.
And he has his hand on the pulse, his fingers on the pulse of kind of things that are happening. Tomorrow, I think I've just gotten myself it's doing a whole lot of stuff. I'm doing too much. Tomorrow, I'm having a conversation with some folks who are actually have a study at the University of Chicago on 911, right? And there's a conference in New Orleans. I, of course, can't make it, but I promised myself 30 years ago that I'd never go to New Orleans in the summer. So never again. So, but they're having a conversation about how ways to transform 911. And my genealogy group in Alabama, the Black Belt African American Genealogical and Historical Society, yes, long word. But it's a group of folks across the Black Belt who are researching their family histories. We collaborated with the University of Chicago to talk to people, particularly African Americans in Alabama, about their experiences with 911. And it was a real interesting conversation, but not anything outside of what we hear about, people and their experiences with law enforcement. And, law enforcement to medical response to fire response, right? There's been some interesting stuff, but I hope that because they've worked on this and done a really big look across the country and talked to all of the constituents. And what I'm really hoping is that there are real policy changes that happen as a result of this study and the work that they're doing to transform 911. That's the name of the project, is Transform 911. They have a website, transform911.org, and I need to get some extra money for building that too. But the website is interesting because you see the ways that it works. And listen, I've had some places where I have been very thankful for the 911. You know, I used to tell this story when I was in graduate school upstate New York. Actually, I got harassed by the police
In New York.
in New York, right? Yeah, right. A little 5'2" me, but all of, and I was much smaller than I am now. But it's like, what am I gonna do, right? But I had a serious incident of police harassment, and I gave them this story, which was a true story, but it played on people's ideas and stereotypes. And I said, you know, it's awful that I come here, I'm up here working on a master's degree, and I have to deal with the police harassing me, right? And placing 1,000 tickets on my car every day. Seriously, no joke, no joke. Thankfully, the mayor was on my thesis committee. The mayor was a historian on my thesis committee. They didn't know it. And he reamed them out, and a couple of them actually lost their jobs. But the other thing was the story I told was about me and my old car, the same car they were picking at. I was on my way to work at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, okay? My old car, God bless her, she stopped on the highway. Now, you know, that's dangerous, right? Stopping on the interstate. So I pull over there, and as I'm pulling over, I'm like, oh my God, this is like in the, you know, days where people, not everybody have cell phone. So I was like, oh God, what am I gonna do? I didn't know there was a guy on the other side of the interstate who was headed home, an off-duty white police officer in Birmingham, Alabama, saw my car stop on the interstate. He got off. He could have just continued to his house. He got off the interstate, looped back around, picked me up, and took me to my job at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Right? Right? Was wonderful. And so I was like, now, surely I could get better treatment in upstate New York than Birmingham, Alabama. Of course, everybody's by that point, you know, all of the things are out and, oh, we're not monsters, but it shows the, you know, that the pervasiveness, right, of these kinds of things.
I think that's one of the most frustrating things is why I'm now attending things like this. It was so open and so fair. Judged me when we were with my relatives from Chicago. We're talking about my grandma getting mugged on the south side, and that's why they moved her out. But they weren't saying nice things about Black people. But I was in junior high when Martin Luther King was killed in Virginia. And we were visiting that and stop me from saying something. But he was shushing me. And I always thought of him as a very fair, open-minded man. I was furious. And I wanted to shush me. We were in a car and I was in the back seat, so that's what would have happened if I had spoken in mind. But I just passed that he's done.
Thank you very much for sharing that. We are going to conclude the online portion here. Thank you all very much for joining us online, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.